When trouble comes up anywhere in the world, they don't call Beijing, they don't call Moscow, they call us. That's how we roll. Thus, President Obama explained America's global role to CBS recently. And that is how the media seems to understand America's role in bombing Iraq and Syria. So what is going on? Have we really forgotten the last decade? And how well does the corporate media serve us in giving us the truth behind this bombing campaign? Why is it that in the UK, every national newspaper, with the exception of The Independent, supports this war? Why is it that the US media, although in some cases much more sceptical than during Operation Iraqi Freedom, has uncritically regurgitated US official claims about the supposed threat to US national security? And why is no one able to explain the fact that in the areas ruled by ISIS, who could hardly be more ideal villains, many Sunni Arabs prefer to live under them than under the Iraqi government? There is a long history of the media being pressed into the service of war, more or less willingly. There is the explosion on the USS Maine in 1898, which was blamed by the press on the Spanish and thus helped to justify the Spanish-American War. There's the Gulf of Tonkin incident in which the US media reported that North Vietnamese forces had fired unprovoked on an American ship. This justified Lyndon B. Johnson's escalation in Vietnam. And there are the claims of Kuwaiti babies being torn from incubators by Iraqi forces, which were dreamed up by a PR agency named Hill and Knowlton and repeated faithfully by the media. That helped secure the consensus for the first Gulf War, led by Bush the Elder in 1991. But perhaps the cherry on the cake is the media's performance in the presentation and sale of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the invasion led by George W. Bush. The extent and depth of media complicity in the packaging of the Iraq invasion is perhaps best summed up in the neologism embedded media. It wasn't just that journalists reported from Iraq under Pentagon supervision and rules. It wasn't just that studies found that the media relied overwhelmingly on official sources and particularly on military figures for their information about the invasion, thus giving their coverage a strong pro-war bias. And it wasn't just that the populist tabloids fear-mongering, 45 minutes from doom and so on. The establishment papers, from the New York Times to the Observer in London, essentially became arms of their respective governments. They regurgitated uncritically falsehoods about Iraq's alleged WMDs fed to them by government officials. In the Observer's case, they actually suppressed critical stories to spare the Blair government's blushes. This pattern continued long into the invasion. The reflex of senior journalists was to identify with the war-making powers, a relationship most vividly apparent in BBC political editor Andrew Marr's gushing claim after Saddam Hussein's overthrow that Blair stood a larger man, proven right when his critics had been wrong. Whether it was falsely attributing the Iraqi insurgency to al-Qaeda and claiming that it mostly targeted civilians, ignoring the terrible long-term record of the United States in Iraq, including the sanctions policy, which UN officials had described as genocidal, downplaying the scale of human disasters suffered by Iraqi civilians as a result of US bombing, for example, the media's response to the Lancet report, or rationalizing the use of torture in Abu Ghraib by referencing ticking bomb scenarios. The persistent thrust of the corporate media's coverage was to strip away history and context, demonize opposition forces, escalate the perceived threat from those forces, and whitewash US conduct. And this had a palpable effect on public opinion, as polls suggest that as late as 2005, millions of Americans believed that Iraq had both had weapons of mass destruction and participated in the attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001. In many ways, this war is a continuation of the last war, and the media coverage follows similar patterns. Once again, there's hype about a supposed threat to national security, there are fears about terrorism, and there are the predictable humanitarian arguments for intervention. From Fox News to liberal pundits such as Jeffrey Goldberg, Nicholas Kristof, and Leon Wieseltier, there's a line of pro-war advocacy forming in the US media. One of the most useful things that the US media could do for this administration is to forget. They've forgotten, as we're led to war against ISIS with the support of the Syrian regime and the Iraq regime, that only a year ago the US State Department and House intellectuals of the Obama administration were saying, we had to wage war against Assad. That was essential, John Kerry said, to defend America's allies and its own national security. He went so far as to say, this is our Munich moment. Now that the mission has changed, and it's one of Assad's most deadly opponents that the war is to be waged against in the name of national security and with the tacit support of the Syrian regime itself, the incongruity is rarely mentioned in the reporting. The media have even forgotten their own contribution to making the case for war. In the run-up to the bombing campaign, there appeared in the US media a series of reports about something called the Khorasan Group, an al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria, supposedly planning attacks on US soil. According to CNN, this included the use of explosive clothes. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the wire services all followed suit with the uncritical regurgitation of statements from the US government, usually from anonymous officials. But strangely, as the journalists Glenn Greenwald and Murtaza Hussain have pointed out, the media just as quickly forgot about everything it said before within a short time, and now openly admit that this group poses little realistic threat to the US. Not only that, but the name of this supposed group seems to have been the invention of the Obama administration. It had never been heard of until these reports. Above all, the media have forgotten the role of the US occupation of Iraq in building up the arsenals of sectarianism in that country. The state built on the ashes of the Ba'ath regime was constructed with the collusion with official Shiite sectarian forces, including their death squads, such as the Badr organization. To these were added a little-known militia trained under General David Petraeus, called the Special Police Commandos, which tortured opponents to death with, among other things, electric drills. Only a few newspaper reports have ever mentioned these death squads. For example, Patrick Coburn and Andrew Buntham wrote in The Independent that up to 3/4 of the corpses stacked in Baghdad's central mortuary show evidence of gunshot wounds to the head or injuries caused by drill bits or burning cigarettes. Many of them were killed by sectarian Shiite groups under the control of the Ministry of the Interior. One result of this was that, according to the United Nations, torture in Iraqi prisons was worse under the new regime than under Saddam. Now, this matters today because, as part of the Bush administration's final surge to kill the insurgency, they paid Sunni opposition forces to join the US side and fight al-Qaeda. Now, these groups were promised that Sunnis would no longer be persecuted and their interests would be represented in the government. But the Maliki regime, supported by the US, continues to use state violence against Sunni opponents. Few reports mention this, but intriguingly, the New York Times has covered it. They refer to a pattern of often indiscriminate shelling and airstrikes on Sunni areas by the armed forces of the Shiite-led Iraqi government, adding to a long list of Sunni grievances. Many Sunni Arabs, the report suggested, saw the government as a far more lethal enemy than the Islamic State. The Guardian reports that recently 40 Sunnis were murdered in Baghdad by a sectarian Shiite militia while police watched. In the Diyala province, under Iraqi government control, a Sunni mosque was attacked by a suicide bomber and several gunmen. 68 died. In a report by Gaith Abdullah Had, Shia militia men talk of erasure and cleansing. Also largely ignored in the media reports is the fact that ISIS is not working alone and would not be successful if it did. It has been joined by secular Sunni groups, including ex-Baathists, who participated in the capture of Mosul. And indeed, how else could a relatively small cluster of previously defeated jihadist forces, now known as ISIS, have taken command of the situation and captured so much territory? That alliance itself is rather fragile, and as Newsweek reports, there is evidence that the Sunni groups temporarily working with ISIS will happily break with them if a new Iraqi government is put in place. ISIS conduct rightly grabs attention, but while the media has not hesitated to publicize Assad's massacres, the atrocities that are driving ordinary Iraqis to align with ISIS have been overlooked. And that overlooking is very convenient to the case for war. The residents of the Sunni Triangle in Iraq are used to being bombed. They were bombed by the US during the occupation, they've been bombed by the Maliki government, and they're now being bombed by Obama. And the case for war only makes sense if you forget all that, as, happily for the administration, most of the media actually does. What explains the media's constant availability for war propaganda? In a recent paper, the US academic Deepa Kumar argued that the global media conglomerates such as Time Warner and News International have an interest in a powerful American global state capable of defending their profitability and opening up overseas markets. They also, Kumar noted, are notoriously dependent upon official sources for news information, deferential to officialdom, and they dedicate relatively little funding to unprofitable investigative journalism, all of which makes them ripe for official manipulation. In a word, they're structurally embedded with powerful states.